Welcome to Kai Speaks, where we explore the art and science of leadership. I'm your host, Kai, and I believe that understanding human dynamics is the key to unlocking potential for yourself, your teams, and your organizations. I'll be here every other week answering a question from listeners like you. This week, we have a question on what happens if your job is to successfully influence politicians who not only do not share your political beliefs, but are openly hostile to them. Let's take a listen.
Hi, my name is Jen, and here's my question. My organization, which works on behalf of students from historically marginalized communities, does work in some red states where the political environment is hostile to DEI. We're presenting data that shows differential student outcomes by ethnicity, but we want to phrase our policy recommendations in a manner that state policymakers will be receptive to. What are some recommendations for communicating with conservative policymakers in a manner that they will respond to about policies that are not fair or equitable across differences?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I would say the first thing you need is a theory of change. One I really like is called the Intercultural Development Continuum. And what this framework says is that the amount of complexity we can hold around cultural similarities and differences exists on a continuum. And where we are in that continuum depends on the amount of exposure we've had to cultural similarities and differences, and also the intentional reflection we have done on those similarities and differences. So it's a lot like language or math skills, in that if you ask somebody to do something that's too hard for them based on their current capacity, it's going to backfire. It's like asking somebody who hasn't gotten to algebra yet to do calculus and then being surprised when they fail the task or learn to resent you and possibly even the entire field of mathematics. So it's really important to understand where people are and then meet them where they are if you want to have any hope of bringing them along. I know this isn't always satisfying. A lot of times we're like, well, we're right, and they should just listen to us. And this is when we have to ask that question of ourselves and of our organizations of, do we want to be right or do we want to be effective? And we get to choose, right? And if it's a really good day, you might get to have both. But in a situation like you described, it's likely that you are going to have to choose one or the other. Going back to that theory of change, the intercultural development continuum, I think it's probably safe to say that the political leaders you're talking about are in polarization, which means they have developed the ability to discern cultural differences. They tend to miss cultural similarities, and they also tend to judge the differences. So, three things you should expect is strong resistance to any discussions of group differences. You should expect these folks to have a colorblind ideology, right? And you should expect that there's going to be a lot of zero sum thinking about resources. This means that the more you emphasize differences such as race based inequities as a starting point for your policy recommendations, the more you are going to lose them. And it's so tempting to lead with hot button issues that have unfortunately been completely politicized because we deeply feel the urgency of them, right? An example of this for me is the way trans kids are treated in many school districts. But starting with what has been deemed as this woke gender ideology isn't going to get me anywhere, especially in the districts where trans kids need the most support. But maybe, and there's certainly been some fairly impressive case studies around this, if we start by talking about how every kid should feel safe in the classroom, we can get somewhere. Taking care of all kids is something schools are already committed to. And this is a key part of that theory of change, is that being in a certain stage or being in a certain orientation along the continuum does not mean you are a bad person. We often just instantaneously jump to that conclusion when we see polarized people who are not on our side of the issue. When we see polarized people who are on our side of the issue, they're like, oh, yeah, they really get it. They have passion. But when they're on the other side, somehow we immediately get to, oh, these are bad people or dangerous people. And I'm not saying that some of these policies and actions aren't harmful, but that prevents us from starting on what matters most to most people, like the basic safety and well being of kids in their care. If we can find that common ground, if we can find some place where our values do overlap, then we can create more inclusive environments, even if we never lead with that specific word. I want to take a moment here too to say that polarization is not unique to conservatives. It is found across the political spectrum, and no matter where we are on the continuum, any of us can and do move into polarization when our values and safety is threatened. So we might have to do our own work and reflection to move ourselves out of polarization if we want to be able to effectively move anybody else out of polarization and into a more forward leading set of actions and behaviors. And this is a coaching topic that I love working with individuals and teams on, of just how can we be more effective at the things that matter most to us. I will definitely say that if you are liberal or progressive and your job is to work with and influence conservatives, you need to get curious and learn about conservative values and where they may overlap with your own. And so I'll share some examples of the similarities and differences between liberal and conservative values and some of the ways I've reflected on where I fall. So the first one is individual responsibility. This is a big pillar of conservative values versus structural factors, which is where liberal folks tend to focus. And so any of us can reflect on a time that, sure, we succeeded through hard work, but we also benefited from someone else's support or maybe a fortunate opportunity. Thinking about how those two things interplayed, how the individual effort and the external factors contributed to success. I think back when I was getting ready to graduate from my undergrad and I was planning to get a job in chemistry. I really didn't know how to do it. The only ways, and I'm certainly dating myself here, but the only ways I knew of to get a job is to see somewhere that had a sign up that says we're hiring, or I remembered my parents looking for jobs in the local newspaper. But all of the local industry was in oil and gas, and I had very little interest in doing chemistry in that field. So I was pretty lost, and I was thinking maybe I will continue working in a coffee shop. Fortunately, my college advisor got wind of this plan and ordered me, did not ask, told me that there was a large chemistry conference that included a job fair and that I needed to get myself there. And I also needed to have a stack of printed out resumes and all of the other things that you used to have to bring to these job fairs. So I went and I landed several interviews, one of which wound up leading to my first job, which was halfway across the country. It would never have been listed in the local papers. And it was an extraordinarily good opportunity, and it really set me up for success for the rest of my chemistry career. So, sure, I did a lot of hard work to learn chemistry and understand the basic principles. But if I had not had a benefactor step in, I would not have been able to get into that professional career nearly as quickly as I did. Another place where we sometimes believe that conservatives and liberals are on completely different pages are tradition and stability versus change and progress. I have to say I'm someone who's pretty indexed on change and progress. That is certainly imbued throughout the work I do with individuals and teams and organizations of what are all the ways that we can grow and develop and become even better together. But that doesn't mean that I'm not someone who can also find ways to appreciate tradition. I grew up in a very religious home. We were Catholic in a relatively Catholic and certainly very Christian area of the country. And for some deeply personal and painful reasons, continuing on with Christianity was just not an option for me. But I really miss being part of millennia old wisdom, practices, and traditions. I need that grounding in order to lean into the uncertainty of the times we're living in. And I now find that through the Buddhist group that I practice meditation with. So there's ways I might not share a particular faith tradition with somebody, but I can at least appreciate the grounding and stability and support that it might provide for them. And if you're listening to all of this and you're saying, well, sure, but it's still really hard for me to see the strengths of the other side. And it's even more of a reach for you to ask me to see the weaknesses of our side. You might be polarized on this issue. So I would really encourage you to reflect on what are the things that we might have in common with the other side. And I would start with, can I find some common ground with somebody that isn't like the most MAGA of MAGA Republicans, but does have a conservative worldview? I'm going to share 2 podcasts with my paying Substack subscribers that do a beautiful job of exploring how we can make more room in our hearts and minds for people who do not share our values. As tough of an ask as this might feel, I really do believe that finding enough common ground to move our society out of the intense polarization that we're in is the work of our times. That doesn't mean that we give up our values or hope for change. It doesn't mean that we no longer advocate for the things that we deeply believe in, but it does mean that if we want to be effective, we must recognize the basic human dignity of folks on the other side, even when we fundamentally disagree with their actions. All right. Well, that's a wrap for this week. And as always, you can subscribe to Kai Speaks on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or become a free or paying member at kaispeaks.substack.com. Paying subscribers get exclusive content, including curated resources and references for as little as $8 a month. And if you've got a leadership challenge you'd like me to address, head over to kaistowers.com/kaispeaks to share your question. Let's keep growing together.